Hello everyone, I am Mr. Disturbing, and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. The Watchers in the Hills. The autumn of 2014 was supposed to be perfect for Sarah and me. We'd been planning this road trip through the Appalachian Mountains for months, mapping out scenic routes that would take us through Virginia, West Virginia, and into Kentucky. I remember how excited she was about photographing the fall foliage, her camera bag packed with extra memory cards and batteries. We left Richmond on a Thursday morning, my old Toyota van loaded with camping gear and enough supplies for a week-long adventure. The first 2 days exceeded every expectation we'd had. The mountains revealed themselves in layers of gold and crimson, stretching endlessly toward horizons that seemed to pulse with autumn fire. Small towns dotted the landscape like scattered gems, their main streets lined with antique shops and diners where locals greeted us with genuine warmth. Sarah captured it all through her lens while I drove the winding roads, both of us drunk on the beauty of a world that felt untouched by time. We spent our nights at small bed and breakfasts, falling asleep to the sound of wind moving through ancient trees. During the day, we hiked well-marked trails that led to waterfalls and overlooks, sharing the paths with other tourists and local families out for weekend adventures. Everything felt safe, civilized, exactly what we'd hoped for when we planned this escape from city life. By Saturday evening, we were deep in West Virginia, following a route that our guidebook promised would lead us to some of the most spectacular views in the region. The sun was setting behind us as we drove through increasingly remote territory, the road narrowing from 2 lanes to barely wide enough for 2 cars to pass. Cell phone service had disappeared hours earlier, but we weren't concerned. The van was running perfectly, we had plenty of gas, and the GPS showed we were still on the correct route. That's when we saw the gas station. It appeared suddenly around a bend, a single structure sitting alone in a clearing surrounded by dense forest. The building looked like it had been there for decades, its white paint peeling and its single gas pump older than anything I'd seen outside of a museum. A hand-painted sign advertised cold drinks and hunting supplies. Yellow light spilled from the windows into the gathering darkness, and I felt grateful to find civilization in what had become an increasingly isolated landscape. I pulled up to the pump and got out to fill the tank while Sarah remained in the passenger seat, reviewing the photos she'd taken that day. The air was crisp and carried the scent of pine and something else I couldn't identify, something organic and slightly sour. The silence was complete except for the soft hum of the gas pump and the distant sound of wind moving through trees. The bell above the door chimed as I entered the store to pay. The interior was cramped and dimly lit, shelves stocked with an odd mixture of snack foods, camping supplies, and what appeared to be handmade crafts. Behind the counter stood a man in his 60s, thin and weathered, with intelligent eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. He nodded as I approached, his expression neutral but alert. That's when I heard the footsteps on the gravel outside. They were slow and deliberate, not the casual stride of another customer, but something more purposeful. The clerk's demeanor changed instantly. His face went pale, and his eyes darted to the window behind me before returning to my face with an expression I couldn't read. The footsteps stopped just outside the door, and in the silence that followed, I could hear my own heartbeat. The bell chimed again. She entered without making a sound beyond that single chime, moving with a fluid grace that seemed almost unnatural. She was a woman, probably in her 40s, wearing simple clothes that might have been fashionable decades earlier. Her dark hair was pulled back severely, and her skin had the pale, almost translucent quality of someone who rarely saw sunlight. But it was her eyes that made my breath catch in my throat. They were wide and unblinking, staring directly at me with an intensity that felt like a physical presence. She didn't look around the store, didn't acknowledge the clerk, didn't seem to notice anything except me. Her gaze held a kind of hungry intelligence that made every instinct I possessed scream warnings I didn't understand. Behind the counter, the clerk was moving. I heard the sound of a drawer opening and the unmistakable metallic click of a weapon being handled. When I glanced over, he was gripping a hunting rifle with white knuckles, his eyes fixed on the woman with obvious terror. His voice, when he finally spoke, was barely above a whisper. "You need to leave, now." The woman tilted her head slightly, like a bird studying prey, but her eyes never left my face. She took a step closer, and I could smell something strange emanating from her. The same organic scent I'd noticed outside, but stronger now, mixed with something that reminded me of damp earth and decay. Her mouth curved into what might have been a smile, but there was nothing warm or human in the expression. I fumbled for my wallet, throwing cash on the counter without counting it, never taking my eyes off the woman. She watched every movement, her head tilting from side to side as if she were memorizing me. The clerk grabbed the money with one hand, while keeping the rifle trained on her with the other, his face grim with a fear that seemed rooted in experience rather than imagination. I backed toward the door, and she followed with those same fluid movements, maintaining the exact distance between us. When I reached for the door handle, she stopped and spoke for the first time, her voice carrying an accent I couldn't place and a tone that made my skin crawl. "We know where you're going." The words followed me out into the parking lot as I ran to the van. Sarah looked up from her camera with confusion as I threw myself into the driver's seat and started the engine with shaking hands. Through the store window, I could see the woman still standing in the same spot, staring out at us with those terrible eyes, while the clerk kept his rifle pointed at her back. I didn't explain what had happened as we pulled back onto the road. How could I? I wasn't even sure I understood it myself. But as we drove away from that place, I couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had changed, that we had crossed some invisible boundary into territory where different rules applied. The road climbed higher into the mountains, winding through forests that seemed to press closer with each mile. Our headlights carved a narrow tunnel through the darkness, revealing glimpses of trees so thick and tall they blocked out the stars. The GPS had stopped working completely, and the radio produced nothing but static. We were alone in a way that felt absolute and somehow dangerous. That's when I started noticing the lights. They appeared first as distant flickers between the trees, too far away and too brief to be certain of what I was seeing. I told myself they were fireflies or the reflection of our headlights off wet leaves. But as we climbed higher, they became more frequent and more obvious. Small points of light that moved with purpose through the forest, always staying just at the edge of visibility. Sarah noticed them too. She put down her camera and pressed her face to the passenger window, her voice tight with concern as she asked what they could be. I had no answer that wouldn't frighten her more than she already was, so I concentrated on driving and tried to ignore the growing certainty that we were being followed. The lights began to converge ahead of us, gathering near the road like a constellation fallen to earth. I slowed the van as we approached a section where the forest opened into a small clearing, and that's when I saw them clearly for the first time. People, or things that had once been people. They stood among the trees at the clearing's edge, holding what appeared to be lanterns or flashlights, their faces pale and indistinct in the darkness. There were at least a dozen of them, possibly more, arranged in a loose semicircle that followed the curve of the road. They didn't move as we passed, but I could feel their attention like a weight, could sense those unblinking stares tracking our progress. In the rearview mirror, I watched them turn as one to follow our passage, their lights beginning to move again as soon as we were past. They were tracking us, herding us, guiding us towards something I didn't want to imagine. The road began to descend, winding down into a valley where the darkness seemed even more complete. Our headlights illuminated a wooden sign so weathered I could barely make out the words. Millfield, population 127. Below it, someone had painted, "Stay out," in red letters that looked disturbingly fresh. We should have turned around. Every instinct I possessed was screaming at me to find a way to reverse course, to get back to civilization before whatever was happening could fully unfold. But the road was too narrow, with drop-offs on one side and sheer rock faces on the other. There was nowhere to turn around, nowhere to go except forward into whatever waited in the valley below. The town, when we reached it, was nothing but empty buildings and broken streetlights. Main Street stretched ahead of us like a tunnel, lined with structures that might have been shops or homes, but now stood dark and hollow, their windows black and empty. Not a single light showed anywhere, not a sign of life or habitation. It was as if the entire population had simply vanished, leaving behind only the shells of their former lives. But we weren't alone. As we drove slowly through the town center, I began to see them more clearly. Figures standing in doorways and behind broken windows, their pale faces turned toward us with that same hungry attention I'd seen at the gas station. They didn't try to hide or move away from our headlights. Instead, they seemed to welcome the illumination, stepping forward so we could see them clearly. They all had those same wide, unblinking eyes. Some were clearly adults, men and women of various ages, but others appeared to be children, their small forms creating shadows that hurt to look at directly. They watched us pass with expressions that mixed curiosity with something that might have been anticipation, as if our arrival was expected, planned for, celebrated. At the far end of town, the road split into 3 directions. The GPS was completely dead, and I had no idea which way to go. That's when I heard Sarah whisper something that made my blood freeze. "They're following us." In the rearview mirror, I could see lights moving through the town behind us, dozens of them now, flowing between the buildings like a luminous river. They were no longer content to simply watch. They were coming after us, and they were moving fast. I chose the middle road at random and pressed the accelerator, feeling the van surge forward into the narrow passage between towering pine trees. The road climbed again, switchbacking up the mountainside in sharp turns that had me fighting the steering wheel. Behind us, the lights kept pace, flowing up the slope like some kind of phosphorescent flood. The pursuit continued for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Every time I thought we might have gained some distance, the lights would appear again, closer than before, surrounding us on both sides of the road. I could hear sounds now above the engine noise, calls and responses echoing through the forest, voices that didn't sound quite human communicating in a language I didn't recognize. Finally, mercifully, we reached what appeared to be the top of the ridge. The road leveled out and widened slightly, giving me room to breathe and think. In the distance, I could see what looked like the glow of a real town, electric lights that promised civilization and safety. But between us and that salvation lay several more miles of dark forest, and our pursuers were still out there, still tracking us through the night. That's when the van started to sputter. The engine began missing, coughing and hesitating in a way that sent panic shooting through my chest. I pressed harder on the accelerator, but the response grew weaker with each passing second. We were going to break down, here in the middle of nowhere, with those things still hunting us through the darkness. I managed to nurse the van to a small turnout where the road widened briefly before continuing its descent. The engine died just as I pulled to a stop, and the sudden silence was more terrifying than any sound could have been. Sarah grabbed my arm, her fingers digging into my flesh as we both strained to listen for sounds of approach. For several minutes, we heard nothing but our own breathing and the tick of cooling metal. Then gradually, other sounds began to filter through the darkness. Footsteps on gravel, whispers that might have been wind through leaves but carried too much structure, too much intent. They were out there, circling us, taking their time now that we were helpless. I reached under my seat and pulled out the handgun I'd brought for protection against bears and other wildlife. The weight of it in my hands was reassuring, but I knew that 6 bullets wouldn't be enough if there were as many of them as I feared. Sarah watched me check the cylinder, her eyes wide with understanding of just how desperate our situation had become. The first face appeared at her window without warning, pressed against the glass with those terrible eyes staring directly at her. She screamed, a sound that seemed to trigger responses from all around us. More faces appeared at every window, pale and hungry, their mouths moving in unison as if they were chanting something we couldn't hear. I fired twice through the driver's side window, the sound deafening in the confined space. The faces disappeared immediately, and I heard sounds of retreat, cries of anger or pain echoing through the forest. For a moment, I thought we might have frightened them away. Then the van began to rock. They were underneath us, lifting and pushing, trying to tip us over or force us out. I could hear them moving around the vehicle, coordinating their efforts with those strange whispered communications. The van tilted dangerously to one side, and I knew we had only seconds before they succeeded in overturning us. I tried the ignition one more time, pumping the gas pedal and praying to any god who might be listening. The engine turned over once, twice, then caught with a roar that drowned out every other sound. I threw it into drive and floored the accelerator, feeling the van surge forward as bodies scattered from beneath and around us. We careened down the mountain road at speeds that should have killed us, taking curves on two wheels while I fought to keep us on the pavement. Behind us, I could see lights giving chase again, but they were falling behind now, unable to match our desperate flight. The glow of the real town grew brighter ahead, and I began to believe we might actually escape. 30 minutes later, we pulled into a well-lit truck stop where normal people were buying coffee and gas, where the fluorescent lights and familiar corporate logos felt like the most beautiful things I'd ever seen. I sat in the parking lot for 20 minutes, engine running, waiting for my hands to stop shaking enough to walk inside. We drove straight through the night after that, not stopping until we reached the interstate and civilization. I never reported what happened, never tried to find that town on a map, never went back to look for explanations. Some things are better left alone, better left unexplored. That woman's eyes still haunt me 10 years later. Sometimes I wake in the middle of the night, convinced I can see them staring at me through my bedroom window. The mountains never gave me peace again, and I've never returned to Appalachia. What lives out there isn't human, not anymore. And the line between civilization and wilderness is far thinner than most people realize. The Great Smoky Mountains had always been my sanctuary, a place where the weight of the world seemed to lift from my shoulders like morning mist rising from ancient valleys. But after Sarah left and my job at the consulting firm had drained every ounce of passion from my soul, I found myself desperate for something more than sanctuary. I needed silence. The kind of profound quiet that only comes from being completely, utterly alone in the wilderness. The Appalachian Mountains promised that silence, but as I would soon discover, some silences carry their own dark voices. It was mid-October when I loaded my worn hiking pack with enough supplies for 2 nights in the backcountry. The summer crowds had long since disappeared, leaving behind empty trails and frost-kissed mornings that reminded me why I fell in love with these mountains in the first place. My destination was a remote section just west of Clingman's Dome, accessible only by an overgrown trail that required pushing through tangled branches and climbing over fallen trees that had been rotting undisturbed for years. The hike began at dawn, my breath visible in the crisp mountain air as I made my way through dense stands of hemlock and oak. The trail was barely recognizable as such, more of a suggestion carved into the forest floor by countless seasons of rain and snow. I encountered no other hikers, not even the distant sound of voices carried on the wind. The silence was so complete it felt almost oppressive, as if the mountains themselves were holding their breath. By mid-afternoon, I reached the clearing I had been seeking. It was perfect in its isolation, a small meadow bisected by a narrow creek that bubbled over moss-covered stones. The water was crystal clear and shockingly cold when I dipped my fingers beneath the surface. Towering trees formed a natural cathedral around the clearing, their canopy so thick that only scattered shafts of sunlight penetrated to the forest floor below. I set up my tent on a level patch of ground about 20 feet from the creek bank, close enough to hear the gentle murmur of flowing water, but far enough to avoid any potential flooding. The routine of making camp was comforting, staking down the tent, rolling out my sleeping bag, hanging my food pack from a sturdy branch. As the sun began its descent behind the ridge, I soaked my tired feet in the creek and felt the accumulated stress of recent months finally beginning to loosen its grip. Darkness fell quickly in the mountains, transforming my peaceful clearing into something altogether different. The temperature dropped dramatically, and my small campfire seemed pitifully inadequate against the vast black wilderness that surrounded me. I had camped alone countless times before, but something about this place felt different. The silence was too complete, too unnatural. Even the normal sounds of nocturnal wildlife seemed muted, as if every creature had abandoned this particular stretch of forest. Sleep came fitfully. I found myself lying awake in my sleeping bag, listening to sounds that might have been branches settling or might have been something else entirely. A pressure had settled in my chest, a primal unease that made me hyper-aware of every small noise echoing through the darkness. Around midnight, I finally drifted off, only to be awakened hours later by something that made my blood freeze. A cough, distinctly human, emanating from somewhere near the creek. Not the bark of a fox or the grunt of a bear, but the unmistakable sound of a person clearing their throat. I lay perfectly still, my heart hammering against my ribs as I strained to hear any follow-up sound. Nothing. Just the creek babbling over stones and the whisper of wind through the trees above. I reached for my flashlight with trembling fingers and unzipped the tent flap as quietly as possible. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing the familiar outline of the creek bank and the dark water flowing past. But there, at the very edge of my light, sat a figure that made my breath catch in my throat. A woman sat by the creek with her back turned toward me, completely motionless. Her long dark hair hung down past her shoulders in tangled, unkempt strands. She wore what appeared to be a light-colored dress, though the fabric looked torn and dirty. The most unsettling aspect was her absolute stillness. She sat as if carved from stone, showing no awareness of my presence despite the bright flashlight beam focused directly on her. I called out softly, my voice barely above a whisper, but she gave no indication of hearing me. The beam of my flashlight illuminated her clearly, yet she remained frozen in place like a statue. Her posture suggested someone who was lost, or perhaps injured, but her complete lack of response to the light sent waves of unease cascading through my entire body. I blinked, trying to clear my vision and make sense of what I was seeing. When I opened my eyes again, she was gone, completely vanished, as if she had never been there at all. The creek bank was empty, showing only the dark water and the scattered stones along the shore. I swept the flashlight beam back and forth frantically, searching for any sign of movement, but found nothing. With shaking hands, I pulled on my boots and crept toward the spot where she had been sitting. The ground was soft and damp from the creek's proximity, and there in the mud were clear impressions of bare feet. The footprints were undeniably human, pressed deep into the earth as if someone had been sitting there for quite some time. But they led nowhere. No trail away from the creek, no disturbance in the surrounding vegetation. The rest of the night passed in a blur of terror and confusion. I packed my gear with trembling fingers, constantly glancing over my shoulder as if expecting the woman to materialize again from the darkness. Every shadow seemed to move. Every sound carried sinister implications. I broke camp before dawn and hiked out of the mountains as quickly as my legs could carry me, driven by a primal need to escape whatever presence lingered in that isolated clearing. Years have passed since that night, but the memory remains as vivid as if it happened yesterday. I have returned to those mountains many times since, but never to that particular clearing. I have tried to rationalize what I experienced. Perhaps exhaustion and isolation had caused my mind to create something that wasn't really there. But the footprints were real, pressed into the earth as solid proof that someone had been sitting by that creek. Was she a ghost, haunting those ancient mountains? Or something else entirely beyond my understanding? The Appalachian wilderness keeps its secrets close, and some encounters defy all attempts at explanation. This is more than just a ghost story. It's a chilling exploration of inherited fear, of the thin line between family legacy and unexplained terror. In the Appalachian Mountains, some mysteries are passed down through generations, waiting to be confronted by those brave enough or foolish enough to seek the truth. About 18 months ago, I finally worked up the courage to go through my grandfather's belongings. He had passed away nearly 4 years earlier, and while the rest of the family had picked through what they wanted, most of his personal effects had ended up with me. Boxes of tools, old photographs, and stacks of journals filled my garage like silent monuments to a life I thought I understood. My grandfather had been a forest ranger for 37 years, stationed throughout various parts of the Appalachian wilderness. To us, he was the steady, unflappable patriarch who could fix anything, who knew every trail and ridge for hundreds of miles. He was the kind of man who slept soundly anywhere, who faced down black bears with nothing but a firm voice and steady hands. Fear, as far as we knew, wasn't in his vocabulary. That's why the journals changed everything. I had avoided reading them immediately after his death. The grief was too fresh, too raw. But time has a way of transforming pain into curiosity, and eventually I found myself sitting in my living room on a rainy October evening, opening the first of several leather-bound notebooks that chronicled his decades in the mountains. Most entries were exactly what I expected: weather observations, wildlife sightings, maintenance notes for various ranger stations and fire towers. His handwriting was precise, methodical, the product of a man who understood the importance of accurate record-keeping. But buried deep in one of the older journals, I found something that made my blood run cold. The entries were about Rich Mountain Fire Tower, dating back to the early 1980s when he had been assigned a temporary rotation there during peak fire season. Unlike his typical measured prose, these passages were scattered, almost frantic. The handwriting grew increasingly erratic with each entry. July 15, 1983, third night at Rich Mountain. Can't sleep. Keep hearing footsteps on the metal stairs outside. Checked twice, nothing there. Probably settling metal in the cool night air. July 18th, the footsteps again, more deliberate this time. Counted 19 steps, then silence. The tower has 23 steps to the top. Someone, or something, stops just short of the hatch. July 22nd, found my boots moved this morning. Swore I left them by my pack, but they were sitting perfectly aligned by the hatch. No one else has been up here in days. July 25th, can't shake the feeling I'm being watched, even during daylight now. The forest below seems too quiet, like everything is holding its breath. Starting to understand why the previous ranger requested a transfer. The entries continued, each more disturbing than the last. My grandfather, this man I had known as unshakable, wrote about being afraid to sleep, about hearing breathing that wasn't his own, about an overwhelming sense of presence that made him question his sanity. The final entry about Rich Mountain was the most unsettling. July 30th. Something was in the tower with me last night. Woke to find the hatch slightly open, cold air streaming in. When I looked up, there was a shape hanging from the ceiling, complete blackness against the metal rafters. Blinked and it was gone, but my boots were gone too, searched everywhere. They simply vanished. Requesting immediate transfer. This place isn't right. I read those passages a dozen times, trying to reconcile the terrified man in the journal with the grandfather I remembered. The more I thought about it, the more I realized I had to go there myself. Not out of some morbid curiosity, but out of a deep need to understand what had shaken him so profoundly. Rich Mountain Fire Tower sits in one of the more remote sections of the Appalachian Trail, accessible only by a steep 3-mile hike through dense forest. The tower itself is a relic from an earlier era of fire management, still functional but rarely manned in the age of aerial surveillance and satellite monitoring. I had been there once as a teenager with my grandfather, but I remembered very little beyond the breathtaking view from the top. The hike began at dawn on a crisp morning in late October. The autumn air carried that particular Appalachian silence, not the absence of sound, but a quality of quiet that seems to absorb everything. Leaves crunched underfoot as I climbed the winding trail, my pack heavy with camping gear and my grandfather's journals. As I climbed higher, the forest grew thicker, older. These were trees that had stood for centuries, their massive trunks creating a canopy so dense that even at midday, the forest floor remained in perpetual twilight. The temperature dropped noticeably as I gained elevation, and by the time I reached the tower, my breath was visible in small puffs of vapor. The Rich Mountain Fire Tower rose 70 feet above the ridge, a skeletal framework of steel-painted forest green. The structure looked exactly as I remembered, a metal staircase zigzagging up to a small cabin perched at the top, windows on all sides offering panoramic views of the surrounding wilderness. What I hadn't remembered was how isolated it felt, how completely cut off from the world below. I climbed the metal steps slowly, counting each one. 23, just as my grandfather had noted. The stairs creaked and groaned under my weight, the sound echoing through the still air like gunshots. At the top, I found the hatch unlocked, the small cabin empty except for a few pieces of basic furniture and equipment covered in decades of dust. The space was cramped but functional. A desk, a chair, a narrow cot, and windows offering views in every direction. I could see for miles across the rolling Appalachian landscape, ridge after ridge stretching to the horizon like frozen waves. It was beautiful, peaceful even. Nothing about the place suggested the terror my grandfather had described. I settled in as darkness approached, spreading my sleeping bag on the floor and arranging my gear.